The clock on the dashboard says 2:47 in the afternoon, but outside the windshield it looks like the middle of the night. The headlights cut a narrow tunnel through complete darkness, and there is nothing beyond that beam. No town, no gas station, no building of any kind. Just gravel, ice, and an absolute silence that presses against the cab like a physical thing. The driver reaches for his thermos, takes a long sip of coffee, and keeps both eyes on the road. He has been awake for 11 hours. He will not sleep for several more. And the question that most people would never think to ask, where exactly does a truck driver sleep when there is nowhere to stop, is about to become very, very relevant. If most people never realize how different the Dalton Highway is from any road they have ever driven, that is because most people will never drive it. This is not a road in the way most people understand roads. It is a 414-mile stretch of mostly unpaved gravel and packed ice that runs north from Livingood, Alaska, a community so small that the last census recorded 11 residents, all the way to Deadhorse and the Prudhoe Bay oil fields, just a few miles from the Arctic Ocean. Truckers who run this route have a name for it. They call it the Haul Road. And when you understand what it takes to move a load up and back on that road, and what it takes just to sleep safely while doing it, you start to understand why the people who drive it occupy a category all their own. If you are watching this on television and you have been following this series, you already know how far from ordinary this world is. If this is your first time here, the best thing you can do is subscribe and share this with someone you know. Most of our audience finds us because someone passed a video along. That sharing is what keeps this channel alive and lets us keep telling these stories. Now, back to the Haul Road. The route was built in 1974, constructed in just 5 months to supply the Trans-Alaska Pipeline system. It runs parallel to that pipeline for most of its length. And if you are riding in the cab of a truck heading north, the pipe appears and disappears alongside you for hours, elevated above the tundra on supports, crossing rivers, threading through mountain passes. The highway was named after James William Dalton, an Arctic engineer involved in early oil exploration on the North Slope. What Dalton never had to deal with was driving a loaded semi-truck down the road that bears his name in January, with temperatures below -50 degrees Fahrenheit and visibility that can shrink to nothing in under 3 minutes when a ground blizzard picks up off the tundra. That is the reality the drivers of Carlisle Transportation, Linden Transport, and Alaska West Express face on every winter run north. Here is the first thing most people do not realize about sleeping on the Dalton Highway. There are exactly 2 places along the entire 414-mile route where a driver can find fuel, food, and anything resembling services. The first is Yukon River Camp at mile 56. The second is Coldfoot Camp at mile 175. After Coldfoot, the next fuel stop is Deadhorse at mile 414. That means there is a stretch of nearly 240 miles in which a driver who needs to stop has 2 options: pull into a gravel pullout on the side of the road, or press on. For a loaded truck running north in winter, that gap is not a minor inconvenience. It is the central logistical reality of the entire run. Coldfoot Camp sits at mile 175 in the shadow of the Brooks Range. In the summer, it serves tourists heading into the gates of the Arctic. In the winter, it is something else entirely. A refuge, a pressure valve, a place where the temperature inside the trucker's cafe feels like a different planet compared to the darkness outside. That cafe is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every day of the year. That matters because on the Dalton Highway, time does not run on a normal schedule. A driver arriving at Coldfoot at 3 in the morning is not unusual. A driver sitting down to a plate of eggs and hash browns at 4 in the morning while the wind outside hits -40 is not unusual. The cafe is open because it has to be. But most of the time, most drivers on the Haul Road do not sleep at Coldfoot. They sleep in their trucks, in pullouts, in the dark, and understanding what that actually requires, what it demands of the driver physically and mentally, is where this story really begins. Alaska operates under a different set of federal regulations than the rest of the country when it comes to commercial trucking. In the lower 48 states, A driver is limited to 11 hours of driving within a 14-hour duty window before a mandatory 10-hour rest period. Alaska received a specific exemption from the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. Up here, commercial drivers can work a 15-hour driving window within a 20-hour duty period. The reasoning is straightforward. The distances are enormous. The infrastructure is sparse. And a driver forced to stop by lower 48 rules might find himself parked somewhere genuinely dangerous when temperatures are at their worst. What that means in practice is that a driver running from Fairbanks to Deadhorse, a trip that takes experienced drivers somewhere between 11 and 15 hours depending on load type and conditions, may be on duty for the better part of an entire day. Drivers with heavy or oversized loads often cannot complete the full trip in a single stretch. They stop. They rest. They do it in the truck. And here is the thing about sleeping in a sleeper cab at 50 below zero that nobody who has never done it understands. The truck cannot simply be turned off. At those temperatures, diesel fuel begins to change its properties. The wax molecules naturally present in diesel can crystallize in extreme cold, a process drivers call gelling. When fuel gels sufficiently, it will not flow properly through the fuel lines and filters, and an engine shut down cold at -50 may not restart. That is not a minor mechanical inconvenience in the Brooks Range in January. That is a survival situation. So the engines keep running. A truck at rest on the haul road in winter is almost never silent. The engine idles, keeping the fuel warm, keeping the cooling system from freezing, keeping the cab at a livable temperature. And inside that cab, the driver tries to sleep. Not in a hotel room. Not in a bunk at a truck stop. In the sleeper berth behind the driver's seat, while the engine vibrates through every surface and the wind outside can reshape the snowdrifts across the road in minutes. Modern sleeper cabs on the Dalton Highway, often Kenworth T680s or Freightliner Cascadillas, are not the Spartan boxes they were 30 years ago. The berth is insulated and temperature controlled, designed to maintain a stable environment even when outside temperatures would kill an unprotected person in minutes. Many trucks running the Dalton are equipped with auxiliary power units, compact diesel-powered generators that can run climate systems and heating without running the full engine. Under federal MAPI 21 legislation, APUs qualify for a weight exemption of up to 400 pounds, so drivers are not penalized on their load limits for carrying the equipment that keeps them alive. But APUs have limits of their own. At extreme temperatures, and -50 is extreme even by Dalton standards, some APU systems struggle. When an APU is the difference between waking up comfortable and waking up to a cab in the single digits, drivers pay very close attention to how their unit is performing before they close their eyes. Bunk heaters made by manufacturers like Webasto and Espar add another layer of redundancy. Small combustion heaters mounted in the sleeper that burn a small amount of diesel independently of the main engine, providing direct heat to the bunk area. On the coldest nights on the haul road, having overlapping heat sources is not overkill. It is the difference between a driver who wakes up rested and a driver who wakes up in danger. And then there is the question of where to actually stop. Pulling off the Dalton Highway in winter is not like pulling into a rest area in the lower 48. There are designated pullouts, wide gravel shoulders where trucks can park without blocking the lane. But those pullouts come with their own considerations. The first is visibility. A truck parked in a haul road pullout in blowing snow becomes very difficult to see. CB radio is the communication lifeline up here. Drivers monitor Channel 19 constantly, calling out their positions, alerting each other to road conditions, warning approaching trucks when they are preparing to pull over or pull back out. The culture of looking out for each other on the haul road is not a professional courtesy. It is part of how people stay alive. As retired 30-year haul road veteran Kenny Seipel once put it, there are two types of truck drivers on the road: those who have been in the ditch and those who are going. The second consideration is whether the pullout surface is stable enough to trust. In winter, ice builds up unevenly in these areas. A truck that parks on what appears to be level ground and then settles during the night as the temperature drops can wake up at a difficult angle. Experienced drivers learn the pullouts. They know which ones are reliable and which are unpredictable. That knowledge is not written down anywhere. It lives in the experience of the men and women who have run the road long enough to have made every mistake at least once. Here is the part that surprises people most when they really think about it. Sleeping on the Dalton is not just a logistical challenge. It is a biological one. The Dalton Highway crosses the Arctic Circle at around mile 115. Above that line, the behavior of light changes in ways that no intellectual understanding fully prepares you for. In the weeks around the winter solstice, the sun does not rise above the horizon at all in the northernmost sections of the route. A driver running a load north in late December may leave Fairbanks before dawn, drive through the entire day without the sun ever appearing, and arrive at Dead Horse in darkness indistinguishable from the darkness he left behind 12 or 13 hours earlier. The human body's sleep cycle is governed primarily by light, the circadian rhythm, the internal clock that tells the brain when to feel alert and when to feel sleepy, takes its strongest cues from sunlight. When light exposure disappears entirely, as it does above the Arctic Circle in December, that internal clock begins to drift. Researchers and sleep physicians have documented this clearly. The absence of natural light cues disrupts melatonin production and destabilizes sleep architecture. People sleeping in polar darkness tend to sleep longer but less restoratively. They wake up groggy. Their sense of time erodes, and for a professional driver who needs to be sharp the moment he gets back behind the wheel, that erosion is not an acceptable outcome. Experienced haul road drivers know this, not because they have read the science, but because they have lived the consequences. A driver who loses track of whether it is 2 in the afternoon or 2 in the morning, and in the polar night, without a clock, that distinction is genuinely impossible to determine from looking outside, is a driver who may not be in the right state to make good decisions. And on a road where the decisions involve whether the ice on the approach to Atigun Pass is stable enough to trust at 60,000 pounds, being in the wrong mental state carries real consequences. Atigun Pass is worth understanding in detail, because it is the moment on every northbound run where the road stops being merely difficult and becomes something close to severe. The pass sits at approximately mile 244 of the Dalton Highway, where the road climbs to about 4,739 feet to cross the Brooks Range, at the only break in the Continental Divide in Alaska. It is the highest highway pass in the state. The grades on the approach can reach 12%. In summer, rock slides close it. In winter, avalanches close it. The Alaska Department of Transportation monitors the pass and can shut it down without warning. Trucks waiting for an Atigun closure can sit for hours on the south side of the range. Engines running, drivers watching the dispatch radio for any word about when the road will reopen. When the pass is open, crossing it in winter is an exercise in controlled precision. The switchbacks in some sections are tight enough that a long combination vehicle has to use the full width of the road to make the turns. There is no margin for error. State crews water down sections of the highway in winter specifically to create a smoother, more compacted driving surface. And those crews operate constantly. CB communication about where maintenance equipment is positioned is critical. A driver who comes over a crest and encounters a grader without warning is in a very different situation than one who knew it was there. On the south side of Atigun, before the climb, there are pull-out areas where drivers stage when conditions above are uncertain. In winter, those pullouts can fill with trucks, a line of idling rigs parked in the darkness, waiting. For the drivers inside, this is rest by necessity. The engine runs, the cab stays warm, but it is the kind of rest that is never fully restful. Because the radio is on, dispatch is monitoring, and the moment the pass reopens, the trucks need to move. Sleep on the haul road, then, is not a single thing. It is a collection of strategies deployed against overlapping problems. There is the problem of light, or the absence of it, and what that does to a driver's internal clock over a long run north and south. There is the problem of temperature, and the systems required to manage it. There is the problem of location, finding a pullout that is safe, visible, and stable, And there is the problem of time itself. Because on a road where conditions can change rapidly, sleep is always provisional. A driver who rests at a haul road pullout in a storm may wake up to find the road open and a dispatcher waiting, or he may wake up to find the storm worse and the road still closed and a decision to make about fuel. Fuel is a constant variable on the Dalton. The gap between Coldfoot and Deadhorse is nearly 240 miles, and a loaded truck in extreme cold burns more fuel than the same truck in moderate temperatures. Idling, required for heat management, consumes diesel even when the truck is not moving. A driver who miscalculates or who ends up staging at Atigun for several hours longer than expected can find himself in a mathematically uncomfortable situation about how much diesel remains in the tank. Planning for more time than expected and more fuel consumption than estimated is not pessimism on the haul road. It is basic logistics. In the summer, the haul road presents a completely different version of the same problem, where winter gives nothing but darkness. Summer above the Arctic Circle gives nothing but light. The midnight sun is not a metaphor. Above the circle in June, the sun genuinely does not set. It circles the sky at a low angle, casting long golden light across the tundra 24 hours a day. For a driver who has pulled into a pullout north of the Arctic Circle to take a mandatory rest, the light outside is identical at 3 in the morning to what it was at 3 in the afternoon. The sleeper cab's blackout curtains become essential equipment. Without them, the biological signals that tell the brain it is time to sleep simply do not arrive. Experienced summer runners on the haul road treat blackout curtains the way winter drivers treat APU preheaters, not as optional comforts, but as operational requirements. Some haul road veterans use melatonin supplements taken at a consistent time each day to anchor their circadian rhythm against the seasonal extremes. The Anchorage sleep medicine community has documented this pattern among northern workers. The strategic use of melatonin not as a sedative, but as a biological timing signal, taken roughly 2 hours before the intended sleep window to help reset the internal clock against an environment that provides no natural cues. On a summer run above the Arctic Circle, a driver doing this is essentially overriding the most fundamental biological signal system in the human body, replacing the sun with a supplement, because the sun has stopped doing its job. There is something both practical and quietly remarkable about that image. A truck driver parked in a gravel pullout somewhere north of the Brooks Range, blackout curtains drawn, melatonin in the bloodstream, engine idling against the silence, convincing his body that it is night when the sun outside his window says otherwise, and then waking up, drawing back those curtains, seeing the same light he'd left behind when he closed his eyes, and climbing back into the driver's seat to navigate a road where the margin for error is measured in feet. The human cost of running the haul road regularly is something rarely discussed outside the community of people who do it. The drivers who run this route multiple times per month are accumulating a specific kind of fatigue, different from what interstate drivers in the lower 48 experience. It is not just physical tiredness. It is the accumulated weight of sustained vigilance on a road where a moment of inattention can put a loaded truck into a ditch from which recovery requires specialized equipment, and sometimes is simply not possible before the temperature claims the cargo. The mental energy required to drive well never fully releases. It follows the driver into the sleeper berth. New drivers on the Dalton are required to complete multiple training runs with experienced haul road veterans before they run solo. Some carriers require 10 or more accompanied trips before a driver is considered ready to go north alone. That apprenticeship transfers knowledge that cannot be written down. Which pullouts are reliable? Where ice forms earliest? Which sections of road develop dangerous washboard between maintenance passes? How Atigun behaves in different wind directions? The road demands that level of intimacy. It punishes quickly and without mercy the driver who treats it casually. When a haul road driver finally pulls into the Proto Bay yard at the end of a northbound run, fuel low, duty window nearly spent, the first thing that happens is not rest. The load is secured. The truck is checked. The paperwork is processed. And then finally, the driver climbs into the sleeper berth in the company yard at Deadhorse. and tries to get the sleep that will allow him to drive south again. The yard at Dead Horse is not a comfortable place. Temperatures in winter can drop to minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. The wind off the north slope arrives without barriers because there are no trees, no hills, no structures of any meaningful size between the oil fields and the Arctic Ocean. The truck rocks in the gusts. The engine idles. And somewhere inside all of that machinery and cold and wind, a human being who has been awake for most of a day is trying to get enough sleep to be safe on the road again tomorrow. The drivers who do this well, and who have been running the haul road long enough to have internalized the rhythms of the route the way a sailor internalizes the sea, will tell you that it is not something you can explain to someone who has not done it. The knowledge is physical. It lives in the body. When to push through and when to pull over. When tiredness is acceptable and when it has crossed a line that cannot be safely ignored. When the sounds the truck makes are normal, and when something is slightly wrong in a way that needs immediate attention. The sleeper cab in those moments is not a motel room substitute. It is something the driver has built over time into his own specific version of a controlled environment. Thermos in the same spot. Emergency kit in the same compartment. Routine as predictable as the road allows. The isolation that would break most people down is, for these drivers, simply the texture of the job. The silence that presses against the cab windows at a haul road pullout at 3 in the morning is not emptiness. It is the sound of a road that leads to the edge of the world, driven by people who have made that road their own. The next time you see a truck on any road in difficult weather, it is worth taking a moment to think about what the person behind that wheel might actually be managing. Not just the driving, the sleeping, the fuel, the decisions, the systems, the biology, the accumulated knowledge of a road that offers no margin for forgetting any of it. And if you think sleeping on the Dalton is the most demanding thing a professional driver in this part of the world faces, wait until you see what happens when the threat is not ice and darkness, but fire. Because summer on the roads of Alaska and the American West brings a completely different kind of danger. And the drivers who move freight through active wildfire corridors face decisions that most people never imagine anyone outside a fire crew would ever have to make.